All right, so up to this point now, we pretty much have loaded all our contracts. We have all our components laid out, at least in terms of UI. Everything is working except for the most important thing, which essentially is the depositing and the withdrawing, i.e., the staking and the unstaking, right? So we want to be able to put in the amount here and then deposit that amount and withdraw that amount and see the balance change accordingly, the staking balance and the reward balances when we want to issue rewards. We want to see that change as well, right? So how do we do that exactly? Well, in our main component, what we want to do is actually add arguments here or add functionality into our form where we can actually, so that when we submit, we're changing these things. We are going to execute a function that's going to grab what exactly? Well, we're going to want to grab our deposit tokens function from the contracts from our deposit tokens over here. So we want to be able to deposit, right, when we deposit. So we want to execute this. And when we withdraw, when we unstake, we want to execute this, the unstake token. So that's essentially it. So how do we do that? Well, what we need to do actually is back in our app.js, we need to create two new functions, essentially. We need to create the logic so that we can grab those functions from that contract and set up the functionality here. And we're going to do this in our main app because this is where we've been grabbing all of our contract information so far. And this is where we keep the state for our contract information. So it just, architecturally speaking, makes a lot of sense to just keep it all over here, right? So let's just write this out, right? Because this is going to be a little bit complicated. And so I just want to kind of have this fleshed out. So we're going to make two functions, one that stakes and one that unstakes, right? We're going to leverage our functions that we already created in our decentral bank contract, which is the deposit tokens and the what's the other one? And the unstaking, right? And we know that, and let's just think about each function. So the staking function, right? What's the staking function going to take? Well, the staking function, what it's going to do essentially, what we want it to do is we want it to access the decentral bank deposit tokens and then essentially send the transaction over. So send the transaction hash and get that done, right? And in order to do this, we also know that the deposit tokens is a transfer from functionality call that comes from our, if we go to our deposit tokens, it's a transfer from our tether, right? And we know that the transfer from here has to takes an allowance and emits the transfer. And we know that for third parties, party transfers with the transfer from, we also need to run an approval. So we're going to want to have an approval. We're going to want to run so we're also going to want to run the function to approve the transaction before we can actually do the deposit tokens. And all of this is going to be for the stake token, right? So all of this is for the staking. All right, so that's essentially what we need to do. I just wanted to flesh it out because it's important for you. It's important for me, for anyone, for me writing this, for us writing it together, to visualize what we're doing, to understand what we're writing. That's going to make us That's just going to make us better at coding, programming in general. So let's go ahead and do it. So we want to say staking function here. I'm going to make it over the constructor. And essentially, we're going to do this function. It's going to be called stake tokens. Okay. And we're going to do an arrow function. And it's going to take an argument. And that argument's going to be what? Well, it's going to be the amount, right? Because it can be anywhere between 0 to 100. So we're going to have this amount. And So let's actually just write out the deposit. Remember, what we want to do is grab from the central bank the deposit tokens function, and we want to do that from the account, from this account, to deposit it and send that as a transaction, right? So how do we even write all that? Well, the good news is that we have our decentral bank in our state, so we can just do this dot state decentral bank. Okay. And what are we going to grab from that? Well, we want the deposit tokens, right? And what are we grabbing from the deposit tokens? Well, we want the amount. And now we're going to send that. So we do dot send to send it. And here we can actually specify where we're sending it from. So we're going to say from, where do we want to send that from? Well, from this account, right? So this dot state dot account. We also have that in our state. Pretty awesome. And now what we do to run the transaction is we do dot on, and we can say transaction hash like this, and this should be in a string because it's going to read it in string format. And we can run hash like this. Run hash. And that's going to do it for us. But we also want to change probably our loading state, right? Because after this, our loading state is going to be finished loading. So let's set our state of our loading in here to false. And that means actually that every time we run this function, we're going to want to set our loading to true, right? Because every time we run the stake tokens, we want to reset the loading to true until it's finished running the function. Then we set it back to false. So I'm going to move it back in here as true. Okay, so this is just how we write out the transaction. But let's go over this. So essentially what we're doing is we're grabbing the decentral bank, which is in our state already, the contract that we have. And then we grab the deposit tokens, right? That's the deposit tokens function. And we set it up to the amount. And that amount is the input amount. And we send that over from the state of the account. So that's the account state. That's our current, the account that the customer has. And that's the transaction that gets processed. Now, oops, sorry, this should actually be as an argument. So we're going to change hash into parentheses like that. So change hash. So add parentheses around hash. And the other thing is this isn't actually going to work, right? And we know why, right? Because this needs to be approved first. Otherwise, it's going to hit an error. So how do we approve it? Well, we have to approve it from our approve function. And where's our approve function? Well, it's in the tether contract. So we actually need to switch. So what we want to do is we want to say this.state.tether.approve. If you remember, in our approve function in our tether contract, the approve takes an address, which is a spender, and an integer, which is value. All right, so what's going to be the address? Well, we want the address to be the decentral bank address, right? We need to approve the decentral bank address. So to do that, we want to do this.state.decentral_bank._address. And as for the amount, well, we want to approve the actual amount. So we can write amount for this, right? And after this, it's pretty much the same thing. We then just send it, right? We're just running the approval to do the exact same thing we're doing here. So what we want to do is .send all of this, including the open parentheses, and including adding the open curly bracket and the open parentheses. And to correctly close this now, we're going to need to add an extra curly bracket and parentheses here. So in order for this transaction to run, the approval transaction has to run first. And I have another mistake over here because we can't just get approve from nowhere. Approve has to come from this contract in our methods, right? So it's got to be this.state.tether.methods.approve. And deposit token also comes from methods, right? It's coming from Web3, so we're shooting in our methods. So we need to bring it in through our methods. And let's check to see that we're not running into anything crazy. Looks like there's nothing happening here. We're not really calling this yet, so. And finally, what we want to do is actually pass this function now over into our main component, just like we've been passing over the state as properties, we want to now set up this function as a property so that our main component can use it. And to do that, it's quite simple. We can just bring in stake tokens, stoken token. I don't know what that means. Stake tokens equals this dot stake tokens, just like that. And now we're bringing in our stake token function. All right, and that's the code for our stake tokens. And just so you can see it, stake tokens. And maybe if I zoom out, you can see it a little bit better. Maybe this can help. But essentially what we're doing here, let's just go over it step by step one more time. Because if this is really confusing and you didn't understand anything we just did, don't worry, don't worry. There's a lot going on here. So let's just go over it step by step one more time. So we create a function called stake tokens. We have an arrow function here. Essentially, we set the state loading to true first because we want the loading to change to true until we've completed this. So therefore we keep loading. Therefore our loader will come up just in case. Our loader comes up first before we can execute this because we really want to grab all this information before the transactions happen, right? So then, okay, so after we've got our loader running, what we want to do is we have to set up the approval first. We need to have the approval, remember, in order to actually deposit tokens as a third party from the central bank for Tether, because it's coming through these different contracts, and we're using in the deposit tokens the transfer from in order to do that. So the first thing we need to do is approve. So we run the approve, and the approve we set to the central bank address, right? Because it takes an address and an amount, and the amount is the input amount, right? And then that we just send from the account that we're doing it from. Well, not the account that we personally are doing it from, but from what the customer is doing, because you have to remember that it's the customer that will be staking these tokens, and it's going to be that account. And we already have that account in our state, so we can just use it like that. And then we run that transaction before we process this transaction. So that gets run, and then after that, we run the deposit token, and there it's pretty much the same thing, right? It's pretty much the same thing. We're sending the amount from the state of this. We're sending the amount from this account. The amount is that we are depositing. That's the staking amount. So whatever we are staking, that amount from that account, and we run that transaction. And when we're finished, we switch the loading state back to false. And that's our stake token functionality. Whew. Wow, it's a lot of words. It's a mouthful. Even for me to just say it all sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. But essentially, that's what it comes down to.